I'm very happy to shift gears and talk to Dan Cogan-Drew, who is the co-founder and chief academic officer of Newsela. I tell you, as a parent of two small boys who are 10 and 12, trying to get them to read and make sure they are focused and understand what they're reading is critical. And even more so, I would argue, in this pandemic, where we were talking about these broader networks of inequity, people having access to content for their children that allows them to grow and absolutely become smarter in an environment that really is feels like it's favoring those that have versus those that don't have. Let me just do a little bit of a deep dive and talk about this impressive business that Dan has created. Since its inception in 2013, students have viewed Newsela's content more than 1 billion times, making it the #1 online news source for students. Dan brings 20 plus years of professional experience spent working towards a more perfect union. And I love this notion, the perfect union of teaching, learning, and technology. I don't think if you would have said in 2019 that that perfect union would never have been more important than it would be in 2020. I think people would have been saying you're lying. So I think, Dan, you were definitely on the forefront of actually dealing with this perfect union before we actually all knew we needed it. So maybe with that, I'll turn it over to Dan just to talk a little bit about Newsela and how you're trying to tackle this inequity and this system malfunction. So Dan, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Alton. I mean, it's been quite a year. It's hard to know where to begin. So I'd like to start this evening's conversation by sharing a thought experiment. And it's based on the work of the philosopher John Rawls. And so here's the experiment. Imagine that you're going to create a new society from scratch. You can design the system of government, healthcare, education, finance. Or there's one thing you don't know as you're designing it. You don't know who in the society you will be. If you behave rationally, you'll want to design the kind of society in which no matter what role you occupy, no matter what identity, you will have an equal opportunity to live a happy life. Now, if you apply this experiment to the world today, knowing what you know, you can ask yourself, would you be willing to trade roles with any person in our society, taken at random? Would you be confident that this identity would offer you the same advantages that you enjoy today, the same freedom to choose your life outcome? And you might think of it this way. If you had a list of people whom you'd prefer not to trade identities with, who would be on that list? And if that list has even a single name on it, it means that in our quest for a just society, the odds have been stacked against us. And so evening those odds through education has been the basis of much of my identity and of the work that we do at Newsela. The hypothetical based on John Rawls is not just a thought experiment for me. I was adopted at birth. I happen to have been adopted by a loving, well-educated, middle-class family in New York City, which afforded me a great many advantages. But it's never been hard for me to imagine that I might have been adopted or born into a very different circumstance. What if the roulette wheel had come up differently? The other seminal experience that shaped my identity was the difficulty I had learning to read. And Alton was referring to his own son's experience. And my experience for me, fortunately at the age of 6, was sheltered by an intervention that helped me turn things around. I ended up graduating college, even got a couple of graduate degrees. So the results of the intervention stuck with me. But so did the feeling. See, the reality in many classrooms in the 70s and 80s when I was growing up, and even today, is that for the roughly 2/3 of the 51 million students in the United States who are not reading on grade level, one of two things happen. Either they're pulled out of the classroom to receive intervention, or they're given special quote unquote leveled readers that are very evidently to them and to the rest of the class not on grade level. Sometimes these methods work, sometimes they don't. But I'll tell you that when I was called to the door in front of my classmates, I was painfully aware that it meant I didn't belong in that class. And when I returned to the classroom 30 minutes later, it felt like someone had just told a joke and I was entering just after they delivered the punchline. Institutional education has a legacy of challenges and no single solution will fill its many gaps. But if we break it into component parts, we can identify opportunities to make progress. At Newsela, we did this by looking at the classroom through the teacher's eyes. Here's the fundamental challenge that every teacher across the country faces. I have 30, 50, even 150 students in my class with varied reading levels, divergent interests and motivations, and diverse needs and abilities. I have less than 180 days each year to enable each of them to demonstrate that they've acquired the knowledge and skills that are required by several dozen grade level learning standards. Now, as a teacher, I have many tools at my disposal, one of which, the most powerful of which, is content-rich instructional text. The problem is that for decades, the only source of this content has been a textbook that's purchased by my district for every 7 years, and it hasn't helped. Quite the opposite. The textbook is specially formulated to adhere to learning standards and to be sold into as many markets as possible. It's monolithic in every sense of the word. The content in the textbook lacks cultural relevance, it lacks personalization, it lacks accessibility. It was stale on the day it arrived in the classroom, and it inspired no one, including the teacher. So now that the internet has matured, and I never thought I'd use those two words in the same sentence, the devices are ubiquitous. Teachers have dropped the textbooks like a rock. And thus far, the internet hasn't always helped the situation either. It's a jungle out there. A recent study by the RAND Corporation found that more than half of English language arts teachers find instructional content at crowdsourced sites like Teachers Pay Teachers, and nearly half on Pinterest and Google. And we have to stop and ask ourselves, do we really want our nation's teachers finding their next lesson via Google? But what if we ask, if the educational content didn't have to come from education? What if the content came from content outside of education, found online? Teachers are Googling because they believe that there's something better out there on the internet that will engage and bring out the excitement in their students. What are they looking for? What kind of content can do this? First, content that's timely, ripped from the headlines so that relevance is never a question. Content that reinforces the learning science of belongingness by positively affirming the multiplicity of identities that our children inhabit. Content that is complicated and complex, like an article about the intersection of gender inequality and environmental conservation in the fight by indigenous peoples for the preservation of the Brazilian rainforest. Kids can handle this. This is content that acknowledges and respects students' awareness of how complex a place the world is. They're familiar with its contradictions and imperfections. Second, and very importantly, it has to be accessible to every student. If you're like me, one of more than 30 million students not reading in grade level, and if you're keeping track, that's a Canada worth of kids. You need a way to read and understand these stories. You might need supplemental content to help you understand what a rainforest is, where Brazil is, what logging is, why it threatens the indigenous communities and the Earth's climate. If you could sit in the same class as your peers and read that article on your own with these scaffolds at a level that was right for you, you might feel a sense of competence. You might feel that you read successfully today and that you'll be able to read successfully tomorrow. And then third, this authentic content should bring undeniable relevance to your life that helps you see the value of schoolwork. Maybe you're interested in space and you hear the term moonshot. You wonder where it came from. You find Kennedy's Go to the Moon speech at a reading level you can understand and you read it. Then you want to know if a Black astronaut has ever landed on the moon, and you want to know why none ever has. In order to find out why, you have to be able to go down the rabbit hole. There has to be a lot of content. More specifically, there needs to be a library of thousands of authentic, relevant, accessible, curriculum-aligned articles that fit with your teacher's scope and sequence. This is exactly what we've created at Newsela to tackle the instructional content problem. So here's how we do it. We publish 10 new pieces of authentic, high-interest content every day that we license and curate for more than 175 reputable partners, such as the Associated Press, Science Friday, The Guardian, Atlanta Black Star. Every piece of authentic content is instructionalized for the classroom so that every student, regardless of reading level, background knowledge, or vocabulary, can read and engage alongside their peers. We do this by publishing each article length text at 5 reading levels, adding assessments aligned to academic standards, instructional support for teachers, and reporting insights for teachers and administrators. This is meeting the market demand and making lasting change. How do we know? Well, less than a year after we launched in 2013, we had more than 1 million registered users. And as Alton mentioned, today we have more than 2.5 million teachers, 37 million students, and together they've read more than 1 billion pieces of content. And they come from a population that represents more than 90% of schools in the US. Our content amplifies students' engagement and authentic motivation by increasing their awareness of and access to stories that change the way they think about the world. And when this happens, students and their teachers are motivated to do amazing things. Let me share 2 examples. One, a Pennsylvania 5th grade class read a Newsela article from the Baltimore Sun describing the work of a doctor at Johns Hopkins who was developing affordable prosthetic devices through 3D printing. The class sent him and his team letters asking if he would print a hand for another teacher at the school who had lost hers in an accident. Not only did he respond, his team created the hand and then hosted a visit from the students to give their teacher the new prosthetic. Another example is a high school robotics club in New Jersey that read a Newsela article from the Chicago Tribune describing toy cars that give students with a disability more mobility. Their club mentor brought a vision to the faculty meeting and mobilized students and staff to build their own version of just such a vehicle for a boy in their community. When was the last time you heard about this level of engagement after reading a textbook? The takeaway here is that the power of the internet has finally begun to disrupt the educational publishing industry in the same way that digital media disrupted the music industry 2 decades ago. So we have to ask ourselves, how do we go from a system disruption to a system reset? And to answer this question, we have to take a look at what content reaches the classroom and how it gets there. There are many strong efforts underway at the state and local levels to increase the adoption of higher quality instructional materials. But even in districts that have adopted high quality curricula, it often doesn't get used. Why? Because while the curriculum can ensure alignment to standards and rigor, the content that comes with it, if there is any content that comes with it, kills engagement. Solving this problem has led us to engage with hundreds of districts over the last 2 years to help support a reset of their expectations for what instructional content can and should be. We've sat down with them and acted as a kind of content concierge to harmonize the vision and rigor of the curriculum with hand-picked content that sparks the motivation and engagement that they need to reach all of their students. This work to create what we call custom collections has impacted more than 13,000 schools, spanned all subjects and grades, and reached more than 500,000 students. From helping LAUSD restart school this year to Southwestern City, Ohio, where our team co-designed units with essential questions like, was feudalism a force for good? Instructionalizing authentic content isn't done with robots and lasers. It's done with deep empathy for educators and respect for the many decisions that they have worked so hard to make long before we ever arrived. With humility and in partnership, we've begun to change educators' expectations for what content can and must do to support their efforts. A crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Today, even while Chromebooks are on back order and millions more students have the hardware that they need to support home learning, as much as 14% of US households with school-age children do not have reliable internet access. And many of the 13% of US public school students who receive special education services, including accommodations for reading, are unable to access the content because they can't navigate by keyboard, they can't have the text read aloud, they can't simplify the text when it's too challenging. For many students who are behind, the pullouts and interventions they receive keep them behind by feeding them below grade level materials and never advancing from there. They remediate, but they never accelerate. That simply doesn't add up. As Bart Simpson once said, let me get this straight, we're behind the rest of the class and we're going to catch up to them by going slower than they are. All of this was true before COVID. What the pandemic has done is to shine a light on many of these inequities in education, and it's a good thing because you can't fix what you can't see. We recognize that all our work won't solve all the problems in the education system, just one of the most glaring issues that's available to us today, inadequate, outdated instructional content. In 2030, I predict we'll look back on this time and remember it was the breaking point for many of the failing aspects of the educational system that today we lament. In 10 years, society and education won't be perfect, but a few fundamental things will have changed. 1, there'll be ubiquitous access to devices and connectivity. 2, there will be ubiquitous access to high quality instructional materials that are authentic, timely, relevant, and accessible. 3, educators everywhere will be better informed than ever by the science of learning. And 4, everyday instruction will exemplify this in inclusive, learner-centered pedagogies. The world I'm describing is the world we'd all want to live in, where we're all better informed, all more engaged, all more inspired, and all move to action for ourselves and for our communities. This world is a big step closer to one in which we'd not hesitate to change places with the least advantaged among us. So let me pause there. I've said my piece. Alton, I wonder if we have any questions from the audience. I'd love to take a moment to answer those and speak a little bit further about some of our work.
Hey, Dan, thanks for that. Again, exciting times. One question we had from the audience: how do we get to your vision of education in 2030? Part of me is excited about where you're going, and hopefully that COVID and the pandemic has hopefully accelerated people's views towards what should be fair and equitable. At the same time, I'm nervous that it also, because again, costs, school systems, not having resources and money, it may set us back. So what's your view? Like, how do we get to this vision in 2030?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll sort of pick up that thread on the question of funds and where does the money come from and where does it go? And if you sort of think about this from like a pre-mortem perspective, you go forward 10 years and we're having this conversation and none of this has worked out, what will we be looking back on and saying like, well, that's why it happened? And so one of the, I think, things that we're vulnerable to is all the dollars coming in through CARES Act funding that districts and states have access to and potentially more funds on the way. Uh, these is going to go to there's a dynamic at play that is accelerating of sort of the current curiosity with technology and education technology in particular. Uh, it's fast forwarding a lot of the actions, and sometimes the thinking and the planning hasn't been done enough to sort of prepare the system to ingest this money in the right way. One of my greatest concerns is that these dollars that are available to support our communities are going to be spent in a scramble to very quickly fill holes. And in that way, they may reproduce a lot of the inequities that have preceded us. What we need is a moment to stop, think, and plan strategically, looking out not just how are we getting through this school year, because this school year, as difficult as it is, will pass. What we're looking for is lasting change, and that's going to require some strategic thinking that I think is already underway in many state levels, state departments of education. That are going to provoke districts to think about decisions that they can make that will help them round the corner and never look back. I think the greatest failure we risk is that nothing changes, that we look back on this and we say, well, that was really tough. Let's get back to normal. And as we've heard already this evening, normal isn't working.
Yeah, I could not agree with you more. Is you just can't let this crisis go to waste. But Dan, thank you so much for spending time with everyone tonight. Again, as I said, extremely impressive business. Excited about you tackling this.